Verse 7. Keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty. All right. So by no means whatsoever will he clear idolaters, sinners, willful sinners. Okay. People who tell you that the scriptures aren't real, it's a fairy tale book. People who's going around saying that the full moon is the new moon. Okay. People who's going around saying that it's okay to break Sabbath. If you got to go to work, you got to do what you got to do. Right. People who don't give a damn about wearing fringes. Okay. Now, even earlier today, when I was going into my local department store, you know, I happened to run into a couple that, they recognized me because I had on my fringes, right? Now, just like I said in a previous video, you know, the only way that you're going to find someone who could be of the faith is because you have to wear the attire, man. Okay, you have to have on the armor of the Most High, not only spiritually, but on the outward appearance too. So if you're wearing your fringes, then people are going to recognize who you are. All right, so just like I said in a previous video, if we don't wear what we're supposed to wear, so we can be recognized in the street by other sisters and brethren, then how would we know if each other's of the faith? Okay, so if I'm not wearing my fringes, right, then 9 times out of 10 or 10 times out of 10, that brother and that sister probably wouldn't even recognize that I was of the faith. But being that I had my fringes on, he said, "Oh, brother, shalom, shalom, brother, shalom." And I looked up because I was looking at my phone, and I looked over and I said, "Oh, okay, oh, shalom, brother, peace." Right? And he said, "I see you because what? You have your fringes on, right?" That's what he said. "I see you of the faith because you have those fringes on." I said, "Yeah." So I asked him, I said, "Oh, so what you know about the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 37 to 41? He said, "I know a little something about that. I'll be reading. I haven't read all the way to verse 41, but, I know about Numbers, chapter 15, verse 37. I said, "Yeah." I said, "That's the reason why I'm wearing it, right?" But as I'm looking at him, I see he didn't have his fringes, right? Now, the sister that he was with, I'm assuming that was his woman, his wife or whatever. I'm looking at the way that she was dressed, and she didn't have on a dress at all. Now, that's not necessarily saying that, our women have to wear dresses all the time, right? But there's a consequences from coming from, women wearing tight jeans, right? Wearing spandex, right? That have no ventilation whatsoever down there in the places where you need it. All right, Salakia. So if you don't have no ventilation down there and you're wearing this type of material, all right, then the women tend to have issues down there. Okay, you're going to have all sorts of aromas, just to be, for lack of a better word or whatever, to be light on a situation. You're going to have all types of aromas coming from down there that you may not want to come from down there. All right, all sorts of stenches or whatever, because you don't have no air, no ventilation traveling through that area where you need it to be traveling through. Okay, you're going to develop all sorts of infections. Okay, like yeast infections or whatever, let alone other infections down there, because you don't have no air properly traveling through that area. If you're wearing tight jeans, if you're wearing spandex or whatever, right? So this is the reason why the Most High tells us that a woman shouldn't put on breeches that's made for a man. All right, so just like I was saying, as I'm looking at her, I see that she didn't have on the proper attire as a woman should have on, right? So as he's telling me that he noticed my fringes, and just like I said, I went back at him and said, "What you know about the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verse 37 to 41? He's like, "Yeah, I know a little something about that, So as he noticed that, I noticed that he didn't have on his fringes, or his so-called wife or whatever didn't have on a dress, but wearing spandex, right? It's like they sort of try to hurry up and get away from me, right? Because I guess they probably figured that, I was going to become judgmental or whatever and start asking, all right, so What's up with your fringes? If you know about my fringes that I'm wearing, what about the fringes that you should have on, right? And then he probably would have thought that I would have questioned him about his wife. But personally, I don't even know these people, right? I never really seen them in my town, really. Maybe they could have been visitors. I don't know. But I never really came across them in the local department store that I was going to. So I never really seen them, and I wasn't going to get judgmental with them. However, that's what they probably thought. And, they hurry up and got their shopping cart or whatever, and they just went on about their way. So what I did, I just played it cordial, and I told them, peace be unto you. Peace be unto you and your family, your wife and your family, right? And I let them go. You know, I didn't try to judge them or anything like that. But eventually, if he would have stopped and spoke with me, then something like that would have came out. I would have told him, why you're not wearing your fringes or whatever. I wouldn't question him about his wife. You know what I'm saying? But, she knows the deal. If they follow in this faith, they know what they're supposed to do, right? So, yeah, probably I would have asked them, like, why you don't have fringes? If you notice in my fringes, then why you don't have fringes on yourself? Okay? But, just like I was saying, I digress from that. As I was stating in previous videos, the only way he recognized me is because I had my fringes on, right? So, like I was telling to other brothers and sisters in the faith, in the groups that I'm in or whatever, the social groups that's on social media, like this is the reason why we should wear fringes, okay? Because if I'm not wearing fringes and you're not wearing fringes and we happen to cross paths, how would we know we both of the faith if you don't have your fringes on and I don't have my fringes on? More than likely, we're going to walk right by each other and not even conversate. We probably won't even look in each other's direction. Salakia, probably won't even look in each other's direction because there's nothing there to showcase our faith. Right? So this is the reason why I say we should wear fringes. Now, not every, I understand that we're not going to be able to do it every single day because, you have laundry day, etc., etc. You might probably not even have fringes, right? But you got to have something on that lets the world know your faith, right? Because you never know who you're going to come across. This is how you're going to meet other brethren and sisters in the truth, by having on the proper attire. Okay, you can get you a tassel. Just get you one tassel and hang it on your pants or something. You can do that, right? That's not that hard, man. Okay, let alone, having the border of blue with the fringes going around your shirt or whatever, So this is something that's easy. This is a minor law, man. This should be no problem whatsoever to keep, man, right? We should be doing this on a regular basis, man, because this is the only way that we're going to recognize. Like I always hear brothers and sisters all the time say, oh, I'm in a small town and I don't have no other brothers and sisters around here that have the same faith as us. No one around here is Israelites. I can't congregate with nobody. I can't meet no one. Because maybe you're not wearing the proper attire when you're out. If you're wearing the proper attire when you're going about your normal everyday errands, you're going to the supermarket, you're going to the department store, you're going to pick your kid up from school or whatever, right? You're going to the park or something like that, your local park, okay? You're going to the gas station, whatever the hell you're doing, like you should have on the proper attire to let people know that you're of the faith. And this is how you're going to randomly run into people, right? So you can stop complaining about how there's no one in your town or your local city or whatever, that's not around you that has the same faith as us, or, calling upon the same name or whatever, or something like that. That's someone that you can congregate with and network with, right? Because you have to play your part, man. If you're not playing your part, then how you expect other people to play their part and notice you, and then they can meet you and say, oh, hey, shalom, I'm an Israelite too. I follow the faith. Then next thing you know, you can start your networking from there. Okay, so in order for other people to play their part, you have to play your part, okay, which is wearing the proper attire. All right, so like I was saying, this is how the brother recognized how I was of the faith, because I had the fringes. And this is what I was, stressing on my previous videos about. This is the reason why we should wear fringes. It's because this is how we meet other people, other brothers and sisters of the faith, man. Right? So getting back into the scripture. And it read, keeping the mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children, unto the third and fourth generation. All right. So now we're going to jump down to verse 10. And it read, and he said, behold, I will make a covenant before all thy people, which is my people, the chosen Negroes, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Seminole Indians of Negroid descent only, right? I will do marvels such as not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation. And all the people among which thou art shall see the work of the Most High power. For it is what? A terrible thing that I will do with thee. All right. So that means he's going to bring fear and trembling to everyone, right? Verse 11. Observe thou that which I command thee this day, this very day, right? Behold, I will drive out before thee, what? The Amorite. Okay. Just as we read in the book of Genesis chapter 15, right? I will drive out the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Okay. All of the Canaanic nations, right? Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. But ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. Okay? Unfortunately, our people nowadays are doing the total opposite. We're joining hands with these so-called Canaanic nations, the cursed Canaanites, right? We're joining their secret organizations. Okay, we're joining their Bohemian groves, as it says right here in verse 13, right? The Most High told us that we should cut down their groves, but what we do, we join their secret societies, okay, and go visit it, Bohemian groves that's all over the country, right? So all of this right here is a snare to our people, man, because this is what the so-called Canaanites are doing, the modern day Canaanites, right? For thou shalt worship no other God, lowercase g, for the Most High power, which is all caps, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, right? So the Most High is jealous over us, man, when he see us worshiping other lowercase gods, man, right? False gods, idolatry, okay? Breaking the first commandment, all right? Verse 15. Lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go a whoring after their gods. All right, so the Most High is letting you know that their gods is no gods, right? They're a bunch of idolaters, right? And do sacrifice onto their gods, which is every so-called holiday of this society. Okay, they're sacrificing onto their gods, right? And then they're giving free will offerings also in their secret society gatherings, right? Sacrificing, blood sacrificing onto their gods, man, right? And one call thee, and thou eat of his sacrifice, all right? So as it says here, which is a snare onto our people. When one calls you and you eat of their sacrifice, okay, what's that speaking about? That's speaking about so-called Thanksgiving, okay, that's speaking about so-called Sunday's dinner, okay, sun worship dinner, all right, that's talking about so-called Christmas. You have your Christmas turkey, your Christmas ham, or whatever, right? You go to Halloween parties, you eating of their sacrifice, all of the candies around there, all of the cakes or whatever, right? Your so-called birthday, okay, you're eating of that sacrifice, all right, which is the so-called birthday cake. There's nowhere in the scripture that tells us to celebrate our birthday and buy a birthday cake, man, right? That's a sacrifice onto an idol, all right? So you got all of these things, man. You got so-called Easter. You have your Easter ham, all right? You got so-called Memorial Day and 4th of July, all right? That's giving honorarieship and sacrificing to their idols. All right, you're eating of their sacrifice. What's the eating of their sacrifice? That's the so-called 4th of July cookout. All right, all of the so-called glizzies there, right, which is the hamburgers and the hot dogs, right? You don't know what that meat is in there, man, right? It could be anything up in there. It could be a little bit of horse. It could be a little bit of human. You never know, right? A little bit of dog up in there, a little bit of cat. You don't know what you're getting with these so-called glizzies, man, right? Unless it literally states, beef on there or turkey, right? But also what I've come to find after a few studies, any kind of red meat could be counted as so-called beef, right? So you can have a little bit of horse in there. That's counted as beef, okay? You can have your so-called dog meat up in there. That's counted as red meat, which could be deemed beef, all right? You can have any kind of animal, right? You can have your I'm just trying to think of other animals that can, possibly have red meat, right? But, just to give you an idea, you have your horse, you have your bison is okay. Bison, that's a part of the cow family, the bull family, right? You can have your wild deer, right? Your buck, okay? A lot of people, even though some people do eat deer and buck, but not the whole society eats that stuff, man, right? But that can be counted as beef. Okay, so they can substitute what you think is cow for that. All right. You have what else I can say that could be counted as red meat, right? So you have all of these things, man. I can't even really pull one out of the air. But the main thing is horse, right? Or you can say probably human. That could be counted as red meat too, right? So we're living in wicked times, man, right now, right? The times are evil. So you don't know what the hell is going on. You don't know what the hell is being put in your food right now, man, right? And just like I said, any kind of red meat could be counted as beef now, even laboratory grown meat, right? Which is beef and chicken or turkey or whatever. That could be counted as poultry or beef, right? So you don't know what you're getting, especially when you're eating glizzies, man, right? So this is what's being spoken of here when you're eating of their sacrifice. Not only are you celebrating idolatrous holidays, so-called holidays, right? But you're also eating of their sacrifice, which is their food, onto their idols, man, which is their false gods, which is a snare for our people, man, right? So we have to beware. But the only way to beware of all of this is we have to get into these scriptures, man. We have to read. Right? This is a book that is made for our people, man. Right? So getting back to the book of Exodus here. Verse 16. And thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go a whoring after their gods. Okay? So this is what it is, man. When you have our people, like so-called Jalen Brunson, okay? You have Drew Holiday, right, for the Boston Celtics. Okay, who else you got? You got so many actors and sports players, man. Chad Ochocinco, I think his name is, married to a white woman, right? You got all of these dudes, man. Who else? Michael Jordan. Right, supposedly the best basketball player of the world, right? Married to a Canaanite, right? A so-called Egyptian woman, right? You have who else can I say? I think Scottie Pippen. I think he's dating a white woman now. I'm not too sure. You got Charles Barkley, right? Who else you got? You got man, it's crazy, man, right? You have so many of our the men of our nation, man, so-called African American men that's married to so-called Canaanite women. Okay, and the reason why I say Canaanite women because they're the cursed nation, right? The Most High cursed them with the skin they have now. All right, but we will get into that. Just like I said. So this is a snare. You know, they're going to teach our the men of our nation of people to go a whoring after their gods, right? They're going to keep them celebrating Christmas. They're going to keep them celebrating so-called New Year's in the depth of winter, right? They're going to keep them celebrating Lupercalia, which is so-called Valentine's Day in February, okay? Instead of keeping the Feast of First Fruits, they're going to keep so-called Mother's Day, Father's Day, Memorial Day, right? And then turn around and keep the 4th of July right after that. All right, so this is what it means to go a whoring after their gods, okay, instead of after our one and only true God, which is the Most High, man, the God of Israel. All right, verse 17. Thou shalt make thee no molten gods. All right, verse 18. The feast of unleavened bread shalt thou keep. 7 days thou shalt eat unleavened bread, as I commanded thee in the time of the month Abib or Abib, right? For in the month of Abib thou camest out of what? Bondage, all right? Which is the first month of the year, all right? Which is in the middle of March going into April, okay? The first new moon in the month of March was the beginning of the new year for us, right? Verse 19, which is getting to the point, right? All that opened the matrix is mine. Every firstling among the cattle, whether ox or sheep, that is what? That is male. Okay? That's the point, right? But I bring out all of those extra scriptures there just to paint the picture for you of what I'm talking about, right? But the point is right here, verse 19. All that opened the matrix, okay, which is the woman's womb, all right, not the movie that we think of what the matrix is. And every firstling among thy cattle, whether ox or sheep, that is male. Verse 20. But the firstling of an ass thou shalt redeem with a lamb. And if thou redeem him not, then shalt thou break his neck. Okay? All the firstborn of thy sons, okay, thy sons thou shalt redeem, not daughters, sons. And none shall appear before me empty. Verse 21. 6 days thou shalt work, but on the 7th day thou shalt rest. In earing time and in harvest thou shalt rest. Okay? So that means when you're planting your seed and when you're harvesting it, when you're picking it back up, right? No matter what time of the season it is, no matter if it's during the first fruits, okay, or the Passover, or whether it's during the Feast of Tabernacles, all right? No matter what time of the year it is, if it's the 7th day, you shall rest, right? Which is the Sabbath day. Verse 22. And thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks. Okay, what's that? That's the first fruits, as is written right here, of the wheat harvest. And the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. Okay, meaning, when the winter solstice come around. All right, meaning when you can't plant no more seed because it's going to get cold, right? It's not going to grow. The winter solstice is going to destroy it because it's just too cold out there to plant, right? So that's what it means by the year end. It doesn't mean that, it's going to be a new year right after the Feast of Tabernacles, right? Which the so-called Ish people say it is, all right? Verse 23. Thrice in the year shall all your men children, okay, your men children, all right, not the women children, appear before the Most High power, the power of Israel, okay. Verse 24. For I will cast out the nations before thee, and enlarge thy borders, right? Meaning he's going to spread our land, he's going to spread our people if we appear before the Most High power 3 times a year. What's the 3 times a year? That's the Passover, right? And the unleavened bread. That's the Feast of First Fruits, which is the Feast of Weeks, okay? And then you have the Feast of Tabernacles, all right? That's the 3 times a year. If we keep in those ordinances for the Most High, man, he's going to give us the enemy's land, man, right? Which is the so-called Canaanites from the past and the present, right? The modern day Canaanites, where we're at in this land today, okay? Verse 25. Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, okay? That's talking about with the Passover, right? Because for the Passover, we got to have unleavened bread, right? Neither shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left on to the morning. So that means when you have your lamb, you got to eat all of your lamb, right? Verse 26. The first fruits, right? Salakia, the first of the first fruits of thy land, thou shalt bring into the house of the Most High thy power. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk. Okay, so, according to, Hebraic culture, when something is referred to as a kid, that's speaking about a goat. All right, that's not talking about like a literal kid, children. All right, our little ones is called children or lads. Okay, but when you have a kid, that's speaking about a goat, a baby goat, right? Or in some cases, it could be a baby lamb, but the baby lambs are called sheep. Okay, so, basically, mainly, when you speak of a kid in Hebraic culture, that's talking about a goat. It's not talking about really a calf, which is a baby cow, or a sheep, which is a baby lamb, or it's not talking about your own offspring, which is your children. Okay, it's talking about a goat. All right. So that means that you're not supposed to eat your goat, okay, and then drink the milk of the mother, which is the goat. So you're not supposed to drink the milk from the goat, right? And I was having a discussion about this too, one time. Now that I recall, we was talking about how, if we're able to eat so-called cheeseburgers, right? Which is, some beef, some red meat with, cheese. And of course, cheese is made from milk. A majority of cheese is made from milk, right? You have some cheeses out there that's made from oil, but a majority of cheese that people consume today in the society is made from milk, right? So we was talking about if we can eat cheeseburgers because, the cow, of course, have milk, right? It feeds the baby calf milks. So I was saying, well, according to scripture, it says, the kid is considered a baby goat, right? It's not considered a baby cow. A baby cow is a calf, all right? A baby lamb is a sheep. Okay, so, and then, of course, your own children, which is your offspring's children, or your lads. It's not a kid. The kid is a goat. So, according to that, you can have a cheeseburger because a cheeseburger is a cow. Okay, it's beef, right? Although your goat is considered red meat too, but it's not a cow. It's not, it's not a cow. It's a goat. So as far as the cheeseburger, if it's made from cow, all right, or if it's made from a sheep, which is all classified as red meat, right? But if it's not a goat, then you can have that cheese with your beef, which is a cow, or your sheep. If you have your cheese on your lamb chops or whatever, you can do that. Okay, if you want to have some cheeseburger helper, which is made from cow, which is, beef. All right. So, and the reason why I'm breaking it down like that, because just like I said before, any kind of red meat could be classified as beef, even horse nowadays, right? So the reason why I'm singling out cow is because when I speak of red meat, or if I mention red meat, I want you to know, or know that I'm being precise on what type of meat I'm talking about, which is a cow. So yeah, you can have your cheeseburger helper. You can have your cheeseburger because it's made with cow. Or you can have your lamb, which is also classified as red meat or beef because it's red meat, but it's not a goat. So you can have your cheese with your lamb too. But when it comes to goat meat, like say if you're eating, the curry goat man, right? From your local Jamaican restaurant, you can have your goat, but you can't have that with cheese. You can't have that with milk or anything with dairy products, okay? Because it's goat, it's a kid, right? And then, of course, that milk is made from the mother's milk. It's goat milk, right? But it all depends on what source you got that milk from. You could probably get the milk from a cow. But there's also goat cheese out there that's made from goat milk. So you have to understand what source that cheese is coming from. So if it's coming from a cow, then chances are you could probably have that goat with the cow cheese. But me personally, I wouldn't do it because it says, thou shalt not see a kid in its mother's milk, but it means in precisely its mother's milk, meaning a goat, not necessarily a cow. Okay, so if it's cow cheese, you can probably have goat meat with that cow cheese. But if it's goat cheese, you cannot have that curry goat. You can't have the curry goat, man. All right, you can't have the curry goat with the goat cheese, man. All right. So it's very technical and complicated, but basically that's the way I can break it down to you, right? So if you didn't understand that the first time, just rewind it back and listen to it again, right? So that's what it means when it says, thou shalt not see a kid in its mother's milk. That's speaking about and some people also even said, and that sort of had me took it in a storm too, because I thought that's what it was. I thought that was talking about, breastfeeding or whatever, when it said, oh, thou shalt not see a kid in his mother's milk. So I was thinking that could be like the baby, like breastfeeding, you know what I'm saying? And then, like how some women nowadays, unfortunately, they like to breastfeed their kid or children, I should say, in public, right? So when you read something like this, you would think, wow, this is speaking about, breastfeeding. That's what it sounds like. And then we call our children kids, right? So you would normally think, okay, well, this is talking about a kid, which is a child, and which it isn't according to scripture. You would think that it's talking about a human kid or child. And then you would think that when you seeing that so-called kid, as it's written here, or child in its mother's milk, you would think that it's breastfeeding, right? But it's really not, because you have to understand the definition of what a kid truly is. A kid is a baby goat. It's not your child per se, right? So that sort of had me thrown there until I understood the true definition of what a kid is, right? So when you understand all of that, then you'll start to see things more clearly, right? So that's what it means when it says, thou shalt not see a kid in its mother's milk. All right, verse 27. And the Most High Power said unto Moses, write down these words, for after the tenor of these words I have made a covenant with thee and with who? The children of Yisrael, okay, the so-called Negroes, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Seminole Indians of Negroid descent only, All right, not the whole entire world, not the so-called Asiatic man. All right, not the so-called Canaanite, ancient and modern day, not the so-called Egyptians, right, which were the Amorites, by the way, from the last dynasties. Okay, not talking about the Hamites, not talking about the Moabites, the Ammonites, all right, not even the descendants of Japhet. All right, although it says in the scripture that they will dwell in the tents of Shem, but the Most High didn't make a covenant with the children of Japhet. Only the children and descendants of Shem, man, the Shemites. Okay, so that's what that's speaking about, man. Right?